This is the truth of the Blue Ridge in late autumn. Life slows, thins, and tests itself. Nights arrive early and hard. Frost holds the grass until midday, and streams run low and glassy. On the ridge's lower slopes, where the wind funnels down through bare oak branches, the cold doesn't just touch, it seeps. It's here, among the brown ferns and the sleeping undergrowth, that she moved like a ghost between the trees. The Bobcat's name would come later, after the man saw her enough times to think of her as more than a shadow. Now she was only motion, light on her feet despite the long angles of her legs showing under her coat. Her fur should have been thick, mottled gold and russet to match the leaf litter, but instead it clung close to her ribs. Even in this spare condition she carried herself with that unmistakable feline dignity, each step deliberate, each glance sharp and assessing. She did not hunt often enough. That was clear to the woods themselves. Squirrels moved bolder, birds fed longer in the open. Hunger didn't come for her like a rushing flood. It came like a winter's ice, slow, inevitable, locking her from the inside out. And yet she did not beg from human cabins, nor skulk around trash bins as a fox might. Her pride was its own kind of hunger. The wind carried the scent of rain, far off still, a promise more than a threat. A lone crow called, its voice flat and final over the hollow. She paused on a patch of flattened grass where the sun made a brief silver through cloud, and for a moment her eyes, amber with dark flecks, searched the line of trees as though waiting for something that never came. In the same stretch of forest, on another trail worn by years of boot leather and memory, Daniel Holt moved without the camera that had once been an extension of his hands. 2 years had passed since it last hung from his neck. He still walked the woods, but not to frame beauty, only to move the ache from his chest into his legs until it tired enough to leave him be. Daniel knew the Blue Ridge in all its moods. He could name the trees by bark and the birds by their calls, even in winter when most voices had gone. But knowledge had done little to protect him when life split into before and after, the day his wife's laughter left the cabin forever. Since then, the forest had been less a place of discovery and more a place that absorbed his silence without demanding anything in return. On this morning, the path was slick with frost where the sunlight hadn't yet touched it. His breath showed in short bursts. He adjusted the scarf at his neck, the one his wife had knitted, and noticed, near the bend by the cedar stand, a track pressed into the mud's thin crust. It wasn't the print of a dog. The toes were round, the pad broad, no claw marks, fresh, edges still crisp. Another print followed, and another, moving off into a scatter of dry leaves. Daniel crouched, hand hovering over the mark without touching it, the way one hovers over a thing that feels personal though it isn't yours. The prints led away from the trail, and though every step of him said to follow, his boots stayed planted. The woods didn't always offer you the right to enter another solitude, so he straightened, kept walking, and let the thought of the unseen animal linger behind him like a shadow walking its own path. That night, in the cabin, he thought again of the tracks, how they had seemed purposeful but not hurried. He had seen bobcats before, rare and quick glimpses, their coats alive with the light of the underbrush. This one, though, felt different. The prints had been light, but there was something in their depth, their spacing, that spoke of energy held back, perhaps because there was little left to spend. In the wild, a bobcat could go days without a success. Full hunt, its range stretching for miles, its body conserving fuel. But when hunger stopped driving the hunt altogether, that was no longer survival. It was surrender. Daniel knew the shape of that surrender. He had carried it himself in his own way. The Blue Ridge in late autumn was a living map of contrasts. Steep ridges stripped bare of their leaves, valleys still holding on to pockets of copper and gold, as though reluctant to let the season go. The air held the sharpness of oncoming frost, and the low sun slanted in long pale shafts that caught in the haze of distant wood smoke. Every sound carried farther now. A jay's call could travel 100 yards without effort. A deer's hoof breaking a twig sounded like a rifle crack in the stillness. In this pared-back season, the forest revealed more than in summer. Without the heavy cloak of foliage, the movements of its quieter inhabitants became easier to track, not because they wanted to be seen, but because there was less to hide behind. On a narrow ridge path, the bobcat passed, her body flowing low to the ground, tail a question mark behind her. She moved with the deliberation of something that understood every inch of this terrain. The muscles along her back worked in a measured rhythm, conserving, never wasting. To most eyes, she would have been invisible. Her coat, faded though it was, still carried the earth's palette, tawny brown laced with muted rosettes, the white underside catching only fleeting glances of light before folding back into shadow. Only a twitch of the ear or a blink of amber eyes gave her away. That and the faint track she left in the soft humus where rain had loosened the soil the day before. She was alone. Bobcats were solitary by nature, each adult carving out a territory large enough to sustain them, but not so large they couldn't patrol it. In these hills, an individual's range might stretch from 5 to 30 square miles, depending on prey and season. The show was hers, though her hold on it had loosened. The winter would test her claim. Below the ridge, a stream wound its way through a stand of sycamores, their white limbs luminous against the darker trunks of hickory and maple. She paused there, crouched among the roots, not to hunt, but to watch. Watching had become her primary occupation. The squirrels leaping between branches were too quick for her current strength. The rabbits, though abundant, required bursts of energy she could no longer spare. So she observed, letting the moments pass without pursuit. A gust of wind rattled the dry beech leaves that clung stubbornly to their branches. The smell of wood smoke drifted in, faint but distinct, curling in from somewhere beyond the stream. She turned her head toward it, nostrils flaring once, then returned her gaze to the water. She drank in slow pulls, each swallow careful, as though her body needed time to remember what to do with the cold. Up on the trail above, Daniel moved with the unhurried pace of someone with no particular destination. The crunch of his boots on frost-laced leaves was steady, unthreatening. He didn't know she was there, not yet, but the forest was beginning to braid their paths in small, patient ways. His route took him past the stand of sycamores where the stream curved. He stopped there, looking down at the water glinting between the roots, though from his angle the bobcat was hidden in shadow. The air smelled of wet earth and the mineral sharpness of running water. He listened to the stream's layered sounds, trickle over stone, deeper gurgle in the pools, and felt the pull of its constancy. It had been here long before his grief, and it would remain long after. That knowledge, oddly, steadied him. Somewhere beyond, a woodpecker tapped in a slow, measured rhythm, the sound bouncing off the ridge like a heartbeat. A fox barked once in the distance, as the bobcat's ears swiveled toward each noise, weighing its relevance, then settled again when no threat emerged. For the forest, this was a moment of balance, a fragile equilibrium before the deeper cold set in. Frost would soon grip the ground all day, locking away the scents that carried news between species. Prey would burrow deeper, and predators would have to work harder for each meal. The bobcat, already on the edge of that effort, would face the choice every wild creature did: adapt or fade. Daniel adjusted his scarf and moved on, not knowing she remained just below him. Their trails crossed in proximity, but not in awareness. Yet the land itself seemed to hold the memory of each of them, the indentation of his boot prints, the light trace of her pads in the mud, parallel stories etched into the same earth. The sun began its slow descent toward the ridgeline, shadows stretching long across the path. The air cooled perceptibly, carrying the faint metallic taste of approaching night. Somewhere behind him, unseen, she rose from her crouch and moved upstream, her passage marked only by the soft displacement of leaves. It was a peaceful moment, but peace in the wild is never without its undercurrent of need. The forest could cradle its creatures, but it did not feed them without cost. For now they both moved within it, one seeking without knowing, the other enduring without asking. The meeting would come, but the Blue Ridge was in no hurry to give it away. She emerged from the tree line at the edge of an open clearing, not with the predatory quickness one might expect, but with the slow composure of a sovereign inspecting land she had already claimed. Her gait was measured, a silent negotiation with the stiffness in her right forepaw. The injury was old, healed enough to allow travel, but the faint catch in her step marked her as one who had paid for survival in some earlier season. The clearing itself was rimmed with frost-tipped grasses, each blade bending under the weight of froze. Zen dew. Above, the sky had given up its daytime blue for a deepening indigo. The last light pooled low on the horizon. Long shadows from the bordering oaks stretched toward her as if trying to keep her from venturing farther into the open. She paused where the grass met the packed soil, her ears twitching once toward a distant rustle that resolved into nothing more than wind. From a distance, one might not notice the loss in her frame. A healthy adult bobcat in these mountains carried a certain fullness, shoulders rounded with muscle, flanks taut but strong. She bore the same sharp angles and dense bone structure, but her ribs pressed close to the skin now, and the winter coat that should have been plush was dulled, lying too flat against her spine. Still, there was no collapse in her posture, no desperation in her movements. Her dignity seemed woven into her very muscles, an invisible garment she wore regardless of condition. A rabbit shifted somewhere near the base of a pine, and her eyes found it instantly. The pupils narrowed, amber irises holding steady. Her body lowered fractionally, forepaw easing forward with practiced silence. The muscles along her back tensed, but only briefly. She held herself there for a moment, the forest air taut between her and the prey, and then she straightened. The rabbit bounded away in a burst of startled motion, white tail flashing once before vanishing into the underbrush. For the bobcat, the decision not to strike was not laziness, it was calculation. Hunting required a burst of speed she might not recoup for days, perhaps longer. In her world, energy was currency, and she was too close to deficit to risk an uncertain payout. She moved instead toward the far side of the clearing, where a cluster of fallen logs formed a low barricade. Hopping lightly onto the first trunk, she paused to scan the tree line behind her, then stepped down. Went into the sheltered hollow the logs created. Here, the air was stiller, carrying the faint musk of old leaves and the sharper scent of resin from a pine that had come down in a summer storm. She circled twice, tucking her body into a crouch against the wood, tail curling close. Her thoughts, if they could be called that, were a mixture of instinct and something quieter, more private. Hunger was not just the absence of food. It was a state that reshaped the mind. The drive to conserve, to watch, to calculate every movement became the ruling order of the day. For a solitary predator, this was survival stripped to its barest form. Above her the first stars began to appear, cold and clear in the deepening sky. The wind shifted, bringing with it scents from higher up the slope, faint, old smoke, the mineral tang of granite where the ridge broke through the soil, the dry, papery aroma of oak leaves that had curled in on themselves against the frost. She processed each in turn, dismissing most, lingering on the traces of movement from smaller creatures that had passed here earlier. Her territory was both familiar and subtly altered. The season's changes were marked not just in temperature, but in the patterns of other lives around her. Squirrels had grown bold with fewer predators pressing them. The deer paths cut deeper into the hills as they sought lower ground. Even the songbirds had shifted their calls, softer now, less urgent than in summer's breeding months. The bobcat remained, the quiet fulcrum around which these smaller changes turned. Though she did not yet know it, another presence had begun to mark the same land, boot prints pressed into the frost, pausing at places where the earth showed her passing. That presence would return again and again, until it became as familiar to her as the scent of the stream or the sound of wind in the sycamores. For now she rested in her hollow, eyes half-lidded but ears always alert, the curve of her body fitting the earth as though it had been shaped for her. The forest breathed around her, each sound and shift absorbed into the larger rhythm. She had no sense of exile in the human sense, only the awareness that her place here was tenuous, dependent on the careful rationing of strength until the world offered more. The night gathered in full, and the clearing became a dark plate rimmed with silver frost. Somewhere far down the slope, an owl called once and was answered. She listened, but did not move. This was her kingdom still, if only in the quiet hours when no one challenged her claim. The cold had a way of stilling the forest until every sound felt amplified. The groan of a branch under frost, the faint drip of water from a thawing icicle, the shuffle of leaves turned brittle in the night air. For the bobcat, this soundscape was both map and measure of her world. She could read a morning by the way the wind carried, the way the frost held or broke underfoot, the way prey voices, or their silences, filled the space between. Hunger was no stranger in her life. In these mountains, even the healthiest predator endured lean stretches between meals, especially in the shoulder between autumn plenty and winter scarcity. But this was different. This was not the clean edge of hunger that sharpened the senses and drove the hunt. This was the heavy, slow kind, the kind that sat in the belly like cold stones and whispered for stillness rather than action. She moved little that day. The sun, weak and pale, barely warmed the frost on the grass before sinking behind a bank of cloud. She stayed within a small radius of the hollow between fallen logs, conserving the heat her body generated. When she did rise, it was with the slow precision of an animal that knew each calorie mattered. Her paw pads pressed into the frosted earth without a sound, the soft fur between them collecting tiny beads of ice. She paused near a half-frozen puddle where the water had cracked under the weight of a passing deer. Leaning down, she lapped at the icy surface, her tongue curling to pull in the cold liquid. Each swallow traveled through her with a faint shiver. Her whiskers twitched as she lifted her head, scanning the edges of the clearing. Once, the rustle of a vole moving under the leaf litter would have drawn her into a swift, low stalk. Now she merely turned her head to track the sound. The muscles in her shoulders tensed, but she made no move to close the distance. The cost was too high for so small a return. In the wild, a bobcat's survival hinged on the delicate equation between effort and reward. A sprint that missed its mark could mean the loss of energy needed for the next opportunity. And in winter, failed hunts had a way of stacking against a predator, each one making the next attempt harder. Her frame, once built for sudden bursts and tight turns, now felt heavier in its leanness, as though her body resisted her own commands. Above her the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of something unfamiliar, faint but distinct, edged with the mineral note of boot leather and the lingering trace of wood smoke. She froze, ears swiveling, tail tip flicking once. There was no immediate threat in the smell, but it was not part of her usual range of scents. She held still until it faded. The cloud cover deepened, muting the afternoon light until the clearing felt like twilight. She returned to the shelter of the logs, curling her body tightly, her forepaw tucked beneath her chest to keep the old injury warm. Sleep was shallow and broken. Every small sound, the wing beats of a jay, the snap of a twig in the wind, pulled her eyes open again. In another life, she might have moved beyond this territory in search of better hunting grounds. Bobcats were known to roam widely when prey was scarce, sometimes doubling their usual range. But movement now was a gamble she could not take. The energy it would cost to cross even a mile of ridge in this weather could not be spared unless she was certain of finding more. From a human perspective, her stillness might have looked like resignation, but for her it was a form of endurance, a way of holding on with the tools she had left. Hunger could press, could hollow, could thin her to a line of muscle and bone, but it could not unmake the quiet authority with which she held her place in the clearing. The frost deepened as evening approached, tiny crystals forming along the edge of her whiskers where her breath met the cold. Her ears tilted toward the sound of a woodpecker hammering somewhere down the slope, then forward again when silence returned. Around her, the forest shifted toward night, each creature finding its own way to last until morning. For the bobcat, the night ahead would bring no guaranteed meal, no certainty that tomorrow would be any different. Yet she remained, silent, watchful, and still somehow whole within herself. In this way, she endured the hunger that could be seen and the hunger that could not. Daniel Holt had learned to walk the forest without announcing himself. Years spent photographing wildlife had taught him the value of moving at the pace of the trees, of matching his breathing to the wind. Even now, without a camera slung at his chest, the habit remained. His boots landed softly, weight rolling from heel to toe, each step deliberate. But the purpose behind that quiet tread had long since gone. 2 years earlier, a diagnosis had shattered the rhythm of his life. His wife, Emily, had gone from vibrant and laughing to frail in a hospital bed in less than a season. He'd stopped taking assignments, canceling a gallery show that was meant to mark his career's midpoint triumph. Tear her funeral. The camera stayed in its case. He told himself it was temporary, that grief would loosen its hold eventually. It never quite did. The Blue Ridge had been their shared landscape, a place they hiked in every month of the year. They knew when the rhododendrons would burst pink in the gaps, when the fireflies would rise in June, when the ridge fog would roll in so thick you could only see a few feet ahead. Returning to these trails after her death was like walking through the rooms of a house emptied of furniture, everything familiar but stripped of warmth. On this morning, the frost clung stubbornly to the grass, even as the sun climbed higher. Daniel adjusted the scarf at his neck, navy wool, a little frayed. Emily had knitted it the winter before she got sick. The forest was bare enough now that the sky spilled down in broad strokes of pale blue, the light casting long, sharp shadows. He paused at the bend where a cedar stand rose in a tight cluster, their green a deep contrast to the skeletal hardwoods around them. That's when he saw it, just at the trail's edge, impressed into a patch of softened soil where the frost had lifted. A paw print. Daniel crouched, leaning on one knee studying it. The print was about 2 inches across, rounded toes, no claw marks. Not a fox, not a coyote. A cat's print, wild, not domestic. The forepad showed the asymmetrical shape he remembered from field guides, and the edges were crisp enough to suggest it had been made within the last day, maybe less. He traced the air above it with a finger, resisting the urge to touch, as though contact might smudge a page in a book. He rose slowly, scanning the trail ahead. Another print appeared a few feet along, then another, angling off into the undergrowth. He followed them with his eyes, not his feet. You didn't simply step into a wild animal's path without thought. There was an unspoken courtesy in the woods, boundaries respected on both sides. Still, something about those tracks stayed with him as he continued his walk. He'd say, in bobcats before, fleeting silhouettes at dawn or dusk, vanishing almost before his mind could name them. But those glimpses had always been of strong, sure creatures, fur full and muscles coiled for action. These prints told a different story. The spacing between them was close, the impressions deep for such a light-footed animal. It suggested caution, maybe fatigue. By the time he returned to his cabin, a low structure tucked into the slope, wood smoke curling from its chimney, the paw prints had imprinted themselves into his thoughts. He moved through the familiar routines without much attention, adding wood to the stove, hanging his jacket by the door, filling the kettle. The cabin walls bore framed photographs from another life: elk bugling in the dawn fog, a red-tailed hawk mid-flight, a black bear nosing at wild blueberries. Dust had settled on the frames. He didn't notice any more. He poured tea and stood at the window, looking out toward the ridge line. It was quiet in that way the mountains could be. No hum of traffic, no human voices, only the small ambient movements of wind and branch. Somewhere out there was the animal that had left those prints. He told himself it was just curiosity, the same impulse that had always driven his work, but underneath he felt something else, a faint recognition, not of the species but of the story written between those tracks. The way they hinted at distance traveled without urgency, at the conservation of effort. He had been living that way himself, doing only what was necessary to get through the day, saving strength for something that never came. In the evening, as the light drained from the sky and the forest folded into shadow, Daniel thought again of the cedar stand and the soil just soft enough to hold a print. He wondered if he was already thinking of the bobcat as she, had passed that way again. The thought was strong, gently steadying. Somewhere, moving under the same sky, was another solitary being enduring the slow stretch of winter. Neither of them was in a hurry. The kettle whistled, and Daniel pulled it from the stove. Outside, the temperature dropped sharply. Stars began to pierce the black above the ridge. He sipped his tea and kept his eyes on the darkness beyond the window, as if he might see her pass by. It was 3 mornings later when Daniel first saw her. The frost was heavier that day, the kind that turned the meadow edges into a pale silver sea under the low slant of the sun. He'd walked farther than usual, letting the stillness of the air pull him deeper into the ridge paths. The cold had sharpened everything, the smell of damp cedar, the faint metallic tang of the soil where the frost had cracked, even the crisp report of each boot step on frozen ground. Rounding a bend where the trail narrowed between 2 outcrops of lichen-covered stone, he stopped. She was there, across the clearing, standing just beyond the skeletal spread of a fallen oak. She was smaller than the mountain lions he'd photographed in the West, but every line of her body held that same concentrated power. The tufted ears swiveled toward him, the amber eyes fixed on his shape. He felt the same stillness she did, like 2 currents meeting and holding in place. Up close, he could see the truth hinted at in her tracks. Her coat was mottled, but not thick the way a winter pelt should be. The fur over her ribs lay too close, and the muscles in her legs looked drawn tight as wire. That old limp was there too, subtle but noticeable when she shifted her weight. Daniel didn't move forward. Instead, he slowly slid the strap of his day pack from his shoulder, crouched, and unzipped the outer pocket. Inside was a packet of venison jerky, something he carried more for habit than hunger. He pulled 1 strip free, tore it into smaller pieces, and laid them on a flat rock a few paces ahead. The cold bit at his fingers as he set them down. Then he straightened, shouldered, dared his pack again, and stepped backward until he felt the shade of the outcrop against his spine. The bobcat didn't move immediately. She kept her gaze on him for several long breaths, then lowered her head slightly, nostrils flaring. A breeze shifted between them, carrying the scent of meat toward her. Her ears flicked forward, then back, as if the pull of hunger and the instinct to stay clear wrestled for ground. She took 1 step toward the rock, then stopped. The tip of her tail gave a single twitch. Her eyes flicked to him, gauging the distance. Daniel stayed still, letting the cold settle into his knees and shoulders. He knew enough to give her the choice. No coaxing, no sudden movement. After another pause, she stepped off the low mound where she'd been standing and closed half the gap between them. Then she stopped again. The wind shifted back, carrying his scent to her. Her ears flattened slightly. She turned her head just enough to look past him into the trees, then back again. The decision came slow, and not in his favor. With a fluid, economical motion, she backed away from the rock, her body lowering toward the ground. Her retreat was as deliberate as her approach had been, and when she reached the edge of the clearing, she melted into the underbrush without a sound. Daniel stayed there a while longer, watching the space where she'd stood. The jerky pieces lay untouched on the rock, dark against the frost. It wasn't rejection, it was caution. He knew this, the way a photographer knows when to wait for a shot and when to put the camera down entirely. The clearing around him felt different now, charged with the knowledge that she'd been there. He picked up the pack and turned back toward the trail, not taking the food with him. If she wanted it later, she would find it without his shadow over her. The walk back to the cabin was slow, sunlight filtered through. The bare trees and fractured beams, catching on ice crystals clinging to twigs. The quiet was deeper now, not empty but full, layered with the sense that somewhere close she might be moving parallel to him, unseen. That evening, he sat by the window with his tea, eyes drifting to the tree line as the light faded. Somewhere out there, she knew of him now. That was enough for a first meeting. The forest would decide if there would be another. Snow had come in the night, soft and steady, covering the ridge in a muffling white that seemed to slow the whole mountain. By morning, it lay in a light crust over the trails, unbroken except for the small, purposeful tracks of birds and the deeper prints of a lone deer crossing the meadow. The air was still, the kind of stillness that carries sound so far you could hear a branch snap half a mile away. Daniel moved carefully through it, each step compressing the snow with a muted crunch. He had no destination beyond the cedar stand, the place where their paths seemed most likely to overlap. The cold burned his lungs in that bracing way he'd come to welcome. It felt honest, like the mountain making its own terms clear. When he reached the stand, he found her already there. She was crouched at the edge of the open ground, her coat blending into the mottled browns of the cedars and the pale snow at their base. For a long moment, he simply stood where he was, watching the way her breath plumed in the cold, the way the fine fur on her ears trembled in the faint breeze. She turned her head toward him, not in alarm, but in acknowledgement. Amber eyes met his across the gap, and the space between them seemed to narrow, not by movement, but by some quiet agreement. Daniel didn't approach. Instead, he sat down on the snow where he stood, pulling his knees up and resting his forearms on them. From his coat pocket, he took a small sketchbook, not the camera, not yet, and began to draw. The pencil moved slowly, tracing the slop of her shoulders, the alert set of her ears, the way her tail curved close to her body. He didn't look up often. When he did, it was to find her still watching him. The forest around them carried on its muted winter business. Somewhere beyond the ridge a raven croaked once, low and deliberate. Snow slipped from a branch with a faint hiss. In the cold air, every sound seemed sharper. Yet between them, there was a kind of hush, as though both understood the importance of not breaking it. After a while, she shifted. Not to leave, just to change her angle, her paws pressing into the snow with a sound too soft for him to hear. Her gaze flicked briefly to the sketchbook in his hands, then back to his face. There was no fear in it now, only that same steady assessment, as if weighing something she had been thinking about for longer than this moment. Daniel felt it then, the thing he hadn't expected. This wasn't about food or even about proximity. It was about recognition, the rare kind that happens without language. She saw him, not as a shape in her territory or a potential threat, but as another presence moving through the winter with his own quiet reasons. He closed the sketchbook, slipping the pencil into its spiral. Slowly, so she could read the motion, he set it on the snow beside him. His hands rested open on his knees, empty, an offering of sorts. Her ears tilted forward, and she blinked once, slow and deliberate. In feline language, it was a signal, trust, or at least the absence of hostility. Daniel's chest tightened at the smallness of it, the way such a simple gesture could feel like the beginning of a bridge between them. They stayed like that for several minutes more, neither closing the distance, neither retreating. The snow began to fall again, fine flakes drifting between them, catching on her whiskers. She did not shake them away. Eventually, she stood, stretching her back legs in a long, unhurried arc, and padded toward the cedars. At the edge of the stand, she paused, looking back over her shoulder. Their eyes met once more. Then she slipped into the shadows, her shape dissolving into the trees as if she'd never been there at all. Daniel remained seated, letting the snow settle on his coat and cap. The cold reached through the layers, but he didn't move. He knew something had shifted, though it was impossible to name it. In her world, trust was not a gift. It was a choice, made slowly, guarded closely. And today, she had let him stand on the edge of it. The day after the snowfall, the sky turned a muted pewter, thick with the promise of more weather to come. The air felt heavier, damp with a cold that sank into the bones. Daniel stood at his cabin table, hands resting on a folded wool hat, thinking of the Bobcat, thinking of the way she had watched him yesterday, unflinching. It wasn't an invitation, not exactly. But it wasn't dismissal either. He knew enough about wild animals to understand the line between helping and harming. A bobcat was no barn cat. They were solitary hunters, their survival tied to their ability to fend entirely for themselves. Intervention could dull that edge, teach the wrong lessons. But he also knew the look of an animal near the edge of its reserves, and he had seen it in her ribs, in the way she conserved each motion, as though every step came at a cost. For years, he'd taken pride in documenting nature without altering it. A photographer was an observer first, a participant never. But grief had blurred his boundaries in ways he hadn't expected. He had stood by as Emily faded, telling himself there was nothing to be done except be present, when in truth he had been afraid of doing the wrong thing. That fear had calcified, embedding itself into everything since. By mid-morning, he'd made his decision. The venison jerky had been too foreign, too processed for her taste, or her trust. What she needed was food that felt like the wild, food she would have taken on her own if she had the strength to bring it down. Daniel pulled on his boots and headed into town, the winding mountain road damp with meltwater. The feed store sat just past the old post office, its wooden porch dusted with salt to keep the ice down. Inside, the smell of hay and grain mixed with the faint tang of leather from bridles and harnesses on display. He greeted Marcy, the owner, and asked for fresh rabbit meat. She raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment. People in these mountains knew better than to ask too many questions about what a man might be feeding. By the time he returned to the ridge, the clouds had lowered, their underbellies nearly brushing the tree line. He wrapped the meat in waxed paper and tucked it into his pack, setting off toward the cedar stand where she liked to shelter. His breath came out in short, visible bursts, quickly absorbed by the damp air. When he reached the spot, the snow from yesterday lay crusted and gray at the edges, broken by the delicate stitching of her tracks. He stopped well short of where the prints led, knowing she might already be watching. Slowly he crouched, unwrapped the meat, and placed it on a low, flat stone where the scent would carry easily. The pink flesh stood out starkly against the white snow. He didn't linger over the arrangement, didn't try to coax her from whatever shadow she might be in. Instead, he backed away in the same slow, steady steps he'd used before, his eyes scanning the tree line without expectation of seeing her. When he was a good 20 yards off, he stopped, leaning against a frost-roughened cedar trunk. For a long while, nothing moved. The forest held its breath. Then from the far side of the clearing she appeared, silent, as if the snow had made her of itself. Her head was low, ears angled toward the stone. She paused with each step, testing the air, reading every particle of scent. Danny. Elle stayed still, willing his body into the same rooted patience as the trees. She closed half the distance, then stopped, eyes flicking to him. The question hung there. Was the risk worth what lay on the stone? Her tail twitched once. He thought of Emily's last weeks, the way she had weighed the smallest decisions. Eat or not eat. Speak or rest. Calculations that had nothing to do with appetite and everything to do with energy. This was that same calculus, written in the language of instinct instead of words. The choice came slowly. She moved forward, closing the remaining space with deliberate steps. At the stone, she sniffed the meat, then took it in her jaws with a quick, efficient bite. She didn't eat it all, not there. She carried most of it into the cover of the cedars, where the shadows took her from view. Daniel exhaled, feeling the release of something he hadn't noticed holding tight in his chest. He turned back toward the trail, not looking behind him. Trust, he knew, wasn't built in a single day. But today, she had chosen to take what he offered, and that was enough to keep him coming back. The snow had hardened overnight, forming a thin crust that cracked softly under Daniel's boots. The morning light was pale and diffused, seeping through a ceiling of cloud that made the forest feel like it existed inside its own muted world. A crow's call echoed across the ridge, sharp, deliberate, then gone, leaving the quiet even heavier. Daniel carried the same pack as before, this time with 2 wrapped parcels of fresh rabbit. He decided on a bolder approach, though the word bold felt almost misplaced. With her, everything had to move at the pace of trust, which meant slower than instinct urged. He reached the cedar stand and saw fresh tracks stitched into the snow, the stride a little longer today, the impressions lighter. That subtle change was enough to steady his resolve. He crouched, unwrapped one portion of meat, and set it in the open just as he had before. The second piece he placed a little closer, to where he intended to sit, still a respectful distance, but nearer than she had yet dared come. When he settled onto the snow-dusted ground, back against a cedar trunk, he kept his posture loose, head slightly bowed as though studying the snow. His breath fogged in the cold, curling upward before vanishing. He knew she might already be watching, reading every shift in his stance, every sound he made. Minutes passed. Then, as if the forest had drawn her from its shadows, she appeared at the far edge of the clearing. The air between them felt taut, a line stretched between 2 points. She moved forward with the same deliberate cadence as always, shoulders rising and falling in measured rhythm, paws pressing into the snow with a silence that seemed impossible for her size. At the first portion, she paused only briefly before taking it up in her jaws. She withdrew into the cover of the cedars to eat, but when she returned, it was toward the second piece. Here, the real test waited. It lay within the edge of what she might consider his presence. She stopped a good 6 feet from it, eyes fixed on him. He didn't meet her gaze directly. To a predator, that could be a challenge. Instead, he looked just past her, letting his focus soften. The forest filled the space. Wind through cedar needles, the muted creak of a nearby branch under the weight of snow. She stepped forward once, paused, then again. Now the muscles along her flanks were visible beneath the winter coat, still too thin, but not as sharply defined as before. Hunger, more than trust, propelled her those final steps. Her nose touched the meat, and she took it in a single, decisive bite. For a moment, she stayed there, the nearest she had ever been to him. Daniel could see the faint frost clinging to the tips of her whiskers, the dark flecks in her amber eyes, even the way her ears twitched independently to track distant sounds. She glanced at him once, brief, assessing, and then turned, vanishing back into the cover of green. It was a small victory, but one that came with its own complications. By bringing her closer, he was shaping her comfort level around a human presence. That thought stayed with him as he sat in the snow, letting his fingers grow cold against his knees. In the wild, wariness was armor. His presence, however gentle, was a seam in it. Later that afternoon, clouds thickened, and a fine snow began to fall, softening the outlines of the tracks they had made. He followed the trail part way, not to find her, but to see where she'd been. Prints leading toward a low ridge, then down into a hollow where a thin stream cut through the snow. He found the remains of a rabbit she had taken on her own, its tracks leading up to a final desperate sprint. That discovery steadied him. She was still hunting, still keeping the part of herself that winter demanded. By the time he returned to the cabin, the light was fading fast. He stowed his pack by the door and stood at the window, watching the snow stitch its quiet patterns across the meadow. Somewhere in the trees, she was moving again, her world and his overlapping in ways neither had sought, but both had accepted. The storms came heavier in late January, burying the ridge paths in drifts that reshaped the forest into something unfamiliar. Fallen logs became white mounds, boulders softened into rounded shapes, and the familiar hollows where deer bedded down vanished beneath the snow. Even sound was altered, muted, absorbed by the dense, cold air, until the forest felt like it was holding its breath. Daniel's boots sank deep with every step, his progress slowed to a careful trudge. The pack on his shoulders was heavier today, not from food for her alone, but from the extra gear he carried in case the weather turned. The cold was the kind that found its way past every layer and stayed there. He reached the cedar stand to find the snow-swept cleats, in patches where the wind had funneled through, revealing old tracks crisscrossing the ground. Among them, fresh prints, the rounded, clawless marks he now recognized as easily as his own handwriting. They led toward a shallow dip between two leaning pines, the snow inside pressed down into a smooth depression. She had been bedding here. Daniel set the meat on the same flat stone as before, brushing away the snow with a gloved hand. Then he sat, not far away, leaning against the cedar's trunk. His breath hung in the still air, joining the faint white mist that lingered around the meat. It was some time before she appeared, but he'd learned patience. She came from the left this time, weaving through the pines in a path that seemed half instinct, half strategy. Her fur was thicker now, the mottled pattern catching the muted light, and though she was still lean, the harsh outlines of her ribs had softened. She approached without the prolonged hesitation of their earliest encounters. The gap between them had narrowed over weeks, each meeting a thread woven into the fabric of familiarity. Today, she stepped into the open, claimed the meat in a low, efficient motion, and began to eat within sight of him. Her ears remained angled outward, catching every ambient sound, but her body language was different. Less tension in the shoulders, tail settled low rather than twitching. Daniel watched her chew, the motion deliberate, each bite accompanied by a short pause. The frost on her whiskers melted in the warmth of her breath, droplets falling to the snow below. He could see the faint crease where her healed paw injury shifted as she adjusted her stance, but it no longer seemed to hinder her balance. The forest around them was subdued. A single woodpecker drummed somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing off the frozen ridges. From time to time, a small avalanche of snow slid from the higher branches, landing with a muffled thump. He found himself noticing these small events more now, as though sharing the space with her had tuned him back into the forest's details. She finished the meal and sat back on her haunches, licking the fur around her mouth with slow, deliberate strokes. Then she stayed there, not in a rush to retreat. Her gaze moved from him to the trees, to the path she'd taken in and back again. It was the longest she had lingered in the open. Daniel felt something stir in him at the sight, a shift not just in her, but in himself. He had been walking these woods for years, but always as an observer. Now, for the first time in a long time, he felt like part of the place again. When she finally rose, it was with the easy grace of a predator that had eaten well enough to face the day's demands. She moved off toward the ridge, her paws sinking into the fresh snow, tail brushing low behind her. He watched until her form dissolved into the pale light and shadow of the trees. On the walk back to the cabin, Daniel thought about the weeks behind them, the slow, careful steps that had brought them here. Trust wasn't something that arrived all at once. It was layered, like the rings in the trees or the tracks in the snow, each one built on the last, and in that shared winter, those layers had begun to hold. February came with a kind of brittle brightness, the kind where the cold cut just as sharply, but the light hinted at something gentler waiting ahead. The snowpack on the ridge had begun to sink in on itself, its crust catching the sunlight in glittering shards. Small rivulets formed where ice melted from the rocks, threading their way toward the streams below. Daniel followed the familiar path to the cedar stand, but this time the ground between the trees was pocked with thaw-softened patches. The forest's scent had shifted, less metallic frost, more of the rich, loamy earth beginning to wake beneath. Overhead the wind moved more freely now that the weight of ice had lessened, rattling the bare limbs in a sound like dry apple juice. She was there before him. Not hidden, not crouched in wary half-shadow, but standing in the open with her head lifted to the sun. The light poured over her fur, showing the healthy gloss that had returned with steady meals and rest. She turned toward him as he approached, eyes narrowing slightly against the glare, and he felt the same quiet recognition they'd shared weeks earlier, but deeper now, layered with something that resembled acceptance. He stopped a few paces from her usual feeding stone and knelt to set down the day's offering. This time, instead of stepping back, he stayed low. She closed the distance without the prolonged hesitation that had once defined their encounters. The soft pad of her paws was clear against the damp ground as she approached. Daniel lifted his camera. The old reflex came naturally, his fingers remembering the way the dials turned, the subtle weight against his palm. The viewfinder framed her perfectly, the rise of her breath in the chill, the way the sunlight edged each hair in a halo of gold. When the shutter clicked, she didn't flinch, just looked at him, holding the lens in her gaze as if allowing him this one intrusion. He took only a few shots, careful not to shatter the moment. Then he lowered the camera, resting it in his lap. She bent to eat, the muscles along her shoulders shifting smoothly, her posture relaxed. Every so often she lifted her head, scanning the forest in brief, habitual sweeps before returning to the meat. Daniel watched her, but also felt himself being watched in return, not in the tense, evaluative way of a wild animal gauging threat, but in a quieter, steadier manner, as if she were cataloging him as part of her landscape. When she finished, she sat back on her haunches, licking her muzzle clean. The old limp was barely visible now, just a faint unevenness in her weight shift. She turned her head toward the ridge, ears angling to catch some distant sound, but didn't move on immediately. The sun was strong enough to warm the top layer of snow, and she seemed content to stay in it a while longer. Daniel leaned back against the cedar, the camera resting across his knees. He realized, with a faint surprise, that the act of photographing her hadn't been about returning to his work or finding some perfect image for a gallery wall. It had been about marking this moment, the culmination of months of patience, the quiet resilience of a creature who had chosen survival and perhaps, in some way, had chosen to share part of it with him. When she finally rose, it was without urgency. She took a slow path toward the ridge, pausing once to glance over her shoulder. He lifted the camera again, but didn't press the shutter. Some things were better left unwitnessed, except by the heart. As her shape blended into the shifting light of the trees, Daniel felt the weight of the months lift slightly. The grief he carried was still there. It would always be there. But something else had taken root alongside it. Something that felt like forward motion, like spring quietly waiting its turn beneath the snow. March arrived quietly, the way winter sometimes concedes without a fight. The mornings were still cold enough to frost the meadow grasses, but by midday the sun had a warmth that coaxed the scent of thawing earth into the air. The ridge trails were soft underfoot now, the snow retreating into narrow ribbons in the shaded hollows. Birdsong, absent for months, had begun to return in bright staccato bursts. Daniel walked without his pack that day. Habit told him to bring it, but something in him knew the time for offerings had passed. The bobcat had been ranging farther lately, her tracks weaving away from the cedar stand toward the deeper woods. She no longer lingered in the same familiar arcs around his cabin. At the edge of the clearing, he paused, scanning the tree line out of long-formed reflex. For a moment, nothing moved except the sway of the branches in the breeze. Then she appeared, materializing from the shadows as though the forest itself had let her go. Her coat gleamed in the sunlight, winter's dullness replaced by the richer hues of health. Her step was quick and even, the old injury no longer visible. She didn't come toward him. Instead, she moved across the open ground at an angle, keeping a respectful distance. When she reached the far side, she paused, head turning to look back. Their eyes met one last time. It wasn't the long, steady gaze of earlier days. It was brief, almost casual, but it carried a weight he felt settle deep in his chest. Acknowledgement. Farewell. Then she slipped into the undergrowth, her form swallowed by the shifting light and green. Daniel stood for a while longer, letting the wind move past him, the sounds of the forest filling the space where she had been. The walk back to the cabin felt different. The path was the same, but the air carried a sense of completion. This chapter, quiet, unplanned, and shaped entirely by choice, was closing. She had what she needed now: strength, independence, the freedom to move without relying on anyone's hand. And in the slow, deliberate work of helping her survive the winter, Daniel had found pieces of himself he thought were lost. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the first stars blinked awake, he took the camera from its case and set it on the table by the window. Not because he planned to use it tomorrow or even the next day, but because it no longer felt like a relic from another life. It was a tool, and like him, it had been waiting for the right moment to be useful again. In the stillness of the cabin, the forest seemed to lean close, carrying its quiet truth. Not every bond is meant to last forever. Some are meant to hold just long enough for both to remember they can stand on their own. If you've ever felt the bittersweet pull of letting go, subscribe now to Joe. In others who believe that connection, even fleeting, can transform us. Tell me in the comments, when have you had to set something free, and what stayed with you afterward?